That question that I asked him at the end of how do you think about the technology that you're each using and how do you make sure that it's for the social good and not, I'd like just briefly to ask each of you, how do you, when you think of the work that you're doing and the power of the technology that you have currently and will be having exponentially more powerful through quantum computing, how do you make sure that you are in line with the social good? Mark, let's start with you.
Yeah, well, I think that the way that it comes across, I think, in Tristan's comments, in the end, I think the concept of intent is a very important concept here. If actually you are clear and you're comfortable about the fundamental ethical intent of what you're trying to do, so that your starting point is actually a fundamentally one where you understand what you're trying to do and that you're confident you feel good about that being seen to be the right thing in terms of the overall intent. I think if you're able to be transparent about the things that you're doing, more transparent and more explaining what you're trying to do, that's an important piece of it. And I think the other thing is to be much more proactive and deliberate about being aware of the societal potential impacts of what you're working on, and that getting ahead of the curve around that kind of societal impact, insofar as you see there's a potential for this to go off the tracks, is important, but also to be helping society to, in a way, take advantage of the goodness that's in whatever intent of whatever you're trying to do is there. So a couple of thoughts there around just the framing of the kind of things we can try and do. And there's lots of things inside our own organisations about how we should think about the things we design, the things we focus on, which we'll talk about in a moment.
Right. Gillian, Booking.com, you touch millions of people every day, right? I mean, and you know a lot about us. So how do you think about the technology that you're using to power, your platform?
Yeah. So I think it all ties to purpose, and indeed your business model, I think, is crucial in that sense. And to really think through, if you think about Booking, how do we basically empower everyone to experience the world? To really think through, okay, what does that now mean for consumers? What does that mean for your partners? What does it mean for your employees? And what does it mean for the environment and the global society? And I think if you really focus on that and really think through what's the role as a company that we need to play, and we are, of course, active in travel and tourism, so if you have a mission like that, we need to make sure that generations to come can still explore the world. So what is Booking.com doing about that? And we have several actions to actively help, because if you are a global platform like that, you can help maybe create standards, right? So there's a lots of influence that you can have, but I think, and it's measurement on consumers, right? Are you actually helping consumers? And we realized, for instance, by measuring that consumers actually want to make sustainable choices, but how do they know they make a sustainable choice, right? So these are just all examples of what companies actually can do, and I think companies need to take much more ownership around all of these topics, including diversity, for instance, as well. And because in the future, people will be more critical to companies doing the right thing.
Right. Bertrand, Novartis is undergoing a pretty radical transformation, right? As a technology company, really. I mean, obviously, technology has fueled innovation, and the science behind technology has fueled innovation in your field. But how do you think about the vast amount of data that you have about consumers and also products and the use of those products? How is that informing what you're doing at Novartis?
Yeah, first of all, I felt very compelled by what Tristan was describing in many ways, and to some extent I almost wanted to scream of, look, put that godlike power of digital and technology to good use here. If I just step back for 1 second, it's like I'm still discovering this industry. I joined a couple of years ago, was coming from the tech space, from retail and other industries as well. But here, talking about purpose, it still takes 12 years and $2.5 billion to get a drug to market when people deeply need it. You still have 500 million people across the planet suffering from rare disease that haven't been understood at all. We have human cells that compose of, human bodies have 40 trillion cells each with 20,000 genomes. So the computational power that we need as well to be able to advance technology on that front is really urgent in many ways. Talking about patients and customers, we have 40% of patients in case of chronic disease don't get the right drug regimen or don't adhere to the treatment, despite often being a matter of life or death in many ways. And still we have, for an industry that is often 10 to 15% of the GDP of most countries, 30% inefficiency in the healthcare system altogether. So I felt very compelled to use that power that you were talking about, Tristan, earlier, to say, come and join us, come and help us. We need the very best of technology in those capacities for something that I think is incredibly purposeful, behind those scientific questions, to really rally behind that and make a dent in that space.
Alan, as the co-founder of LinkedIn, which I know all of us are familiar with, and I will say that Bloomberg Live, we use LinkedIn every day to hunt down people that we want to come speak on our panel. So
You don't
thank
actually
you very
hunt
much. But again, and people may not be thinking about this, but AI obviously is powering a lot of the searches that I appear in, or that when I'm looking for candidates for positions. How do you ensure that AI technology, again, is not replicating biases that we know exist in society, and therefore that your technology is aligning with the greater good?
Yeah, it's a great question. So LinkedIn, obviously, we do a lot of things in the world of human resources. So hiring is something that LinkedIn is used for on a regular basis. So it starts with us, with our values. So we not only take very seriously diversity and trying to stamp out bias in our own company, but also we want to make sure that our tools don't exacerbate those biases and actually make it easier for companies to be able to avoid them themselves. So clarity on your own values can then be turned into the tools that you use in order to make sure your software is actually delivering the right thing. So in the last year or so, because we were worried about releasing features which accidentally had bias built into them, we built a set of internal tools which allow us, whenever we release a new feature, to examine whether the feature essentially provides unequal value to different groups within the LinkedIn ecosystem. So for instance, if we make the change to search, this tool detects whether that search prefers men in the results or prefers another group in the results. Just as an example. That allows us to look at it and make sure, because we've detected something which is out of line with the values that we already understand, it allows us literally on a monthly basis to examine those features and make sure that we are, that any unequal treatment in LinkedIn is something that aligns with those values.
And what do those tools show? Have you found that the products sometimes have?
Oh, yeah. We have. So the reason we put it in is we wanted to be able to detect very specifically a bias in terms of the power of networks. So one of the things which is very true just in the world in general is that if you have a powerful network, you are going to be more successful professionally. It's just true. So what we wanted to do is whenever we release a feature, we want to make sure that basically it isn't essentially over-delivering for the people who have strong networks and under-delivering for the people who have smaller networks. So that's an example, and actually that's the use case which led us to develop this tool in the first place.
I think I also read it at some point. You, the company, became concerned that not enough women were being recommended in certain searches. What was behind that? Why was that occurring?
It was a bias in the data. So if you search for, do a regular search for people on LinkedIn, and the results are 60%, the whole set of 1,000 results, 600 men, 400 women. It turns out that men have slightly more information on their profiles, on average, than women.
Interesting.
So what that meant is that the search algorithm preferred the richer profiles, with more information to process. So the men would appear towards the top of the list, and the women would be filtered towards the bottom of the list. So we changed the algorithm to make sure that the mix within the set of search results you get match the actual distribution of people within the body of people returned.
Do you understand why men have more robust profiles?
So
That's paleological again. Back to
Telling
paleology again.
them.
That's right.
So it's interesting. There's actually a lot of really good research on this, but it actually is there's an actual bias. Men tend to be a little. They tend to put, at least in what we've been
More
protect-
boastful, more verbose.
I'm sorry to say that's actually true.
Yeah.
So men tend to put one or two more skills on their profile when we look at the entire body of men in the system than women do, and it's I don't know, a surplus of confidence.
Right. That's a nice way of putting it.
But maybe if I
Yeah.
can ask, I'm interested by that as well. It's like you talk about feature sets, about algorithm, to be sure to respect that. Does it reflect into the diversity of the team as well? Did you have to make some adjustment there to reflect different points of views or research that feed into it? In the
This
first
is a fantastic question. It's a artificial intelligence, and we use a lot of it. It's built into a lot of things that LinkedIn does. Artificial intelligence is a very difficult thing to understand exactly how it works. So all of us who work in the world of artificial intelligence are now facing a management problem that we've never had before, because a lot of us are managing things which are difficult to understand. At the very beginning of this session this morning, you pointed to the quantum computer and asked if there was anyone in the room who could explain how it works. Unfortunately, artificial intelligence is a little like that. Right? When you build an algorithm which ends up with thousands of axes of decision making, it's not something a human being can actually understand. This is where the diversity of opinion and viewpoint comes into play. Because if you have a more diverse group of people who are building the algorithms and testing them and evaluating them, then they are able to detect greater numbers of biases coming out of the system when they're evaluating the results. So the diversity really matters in a team.
Yeah,
We've found that, in fact, there are three places where this bias comes. I think you've touched on pretty much all of them, I think. The first one actually is the bias in the data. But actually the underlying data that we're working on has built-in bias to it, as we just touched on it. The algorithms, and as they're described, have bias with the way they're constructed, and sometimes we don't understand the implications of those. So being able to run them and see how biases start to sway or even self-correct to some of things you can do becomes very important. But lastly, we all end up still being biased in what we do with the output. And actually one of the most important things is actually when we see a suggestion or something that comes up, what do we do with that? And do we then overlay another bias?
Yep.
The people who are working on top of a process like this. So there's lots of places where this becomes really quite subtle.
Gillian, how does this discussion of bias in the data, bias in the algorithms, bias in the output, how does that affect what you're doing at Booking.com?
Yeah, so this is something you need to be aware of, right? That can happen. And I mean, we have many algorithms at Booking. Finding an accommodation is still quite a complex activity,
Right.
so to make sure that people really get to the right choice to make, there's a lot of algorithms that do that, and throughout our business. But you just need to be aware what biases can be there, and I think for future, if you think about over-tourism and these type of topics, we really need to think, okay, we shouldn't always, because of algorithm, because popular places will get even more visitors.
Right.
So that's just an example of topics that a company like Booking also needs to think about. How do we actively manage that? How do we make sure new destinations are also being featured, for instance? But it's throughout our company. But what I think is the main part to this for companies is how you deal with your culture. Because in the end, it's about the culture and the people that need to look at this and need to flag and need to make these changes. So you see a few elements that are important. It's not siloed but collaborative, like it was said here as well, right? You need different skills, people working together. It's more bottom-up versus top-down, so that's a big change. I think it takes ego and opinion out, right? So it's changed how organizations operate. And the third one is test and learn. I mean, even these types of technologies don't come with all the bells and whistles. No, that still needs to be developed and needs to be controlled. So I think that's the main part which we focus on a lot to make sure that we do that well.
Right. I think one of the interesting trends in travel, I think, are people who want to go to places that are not the traditional tourism places. They want the more local, authentic experience. And so your algorithms are, as you just said, creating the ability to find those places.
Yes.
But what about the people on the, in those places? Do they, what risk do they, I think you just said something along those lines, what's the risk to those local places who may not be traditional tourist destinations? Do they become overrun because you're sending, thousands of people to this small village in New Zealand, for example? Do you think about that when you're building?
Yeah, we think about it. On the one hand, this is also very positive, right?
Right.
Because it brings income.
Exactly.
You see a lot of places, in rural places, where people suddenly can build a farm stay, right? So I think we shouldn't forget the positive part of this. But there's an element that we need to think about. You see it in lots of places in India where it's just unmanageable, right? So, and this is not something Booking can manage alone, because we're not the only company providing customers. But for sure, we are actively looking at how we can basically help and how we can use data, right, to see how also destinations can control this better.
Right. One of the questions I wanted to ask Bertrand was, obviously you have a lot of data, I guess aggregated data, right, on the research that's been done on health data. You have vast quantities of that. Does the move toward creating more privacy protections, does that threaten the research that Novartis is doing? Do you worry about that, or no?
I can very much relate to Gillian's point from earlier in many ways, and actually the debate now that is really happening about bias in data from the get-go has been going on probably for more than a decade, probably a couple of decades within pharma, because by the very default of how we structure our clinical trials, we have to, even to get a representation of the populations to which our drugs show effectiveness, need to capture that from the get-go. So wide representation, hence we have investigation sites on a global scale that have been statistically significant towards the FDA, EMA, and all the institutions as well. So it's interesting to hear that debate coming up now in many other sectors, but it's something on which we had to be very sensitive, even in the design of how we set up our trials, even in design of how we capture our data. We live also in a space of double-blinded, randomized controlled trials, so private trials. So privacy was really something that was also in the very design of the way that we've been driving those businesses for a very long time, by the very nature of it, for protection of the patients, but also by the way it was really set up as such. So it's really interesting to be also in Davos and to contribute to this debate from another angle. We have lived through that. With other challenges, like for example in our case we have maybe more mundane, but we have 2 million patient years of clinical trial data from the last 20 years of trials.
2 million?
And 2 million patient years. And if I'm really candid on this, we are hardly leveraging that data for the greater good. Often those trials are being captured in local laptops by one study team versus another study team, versus think about all the goods we could do if we could tie those properly to understand when we have done those trials with this new mechanism of action. Could it be that it helps other patients who are suffering from chronic back pain on this? Could it be that it's really helping patients suffering from this type of cancer on that? And actually the more we start unifying the data, cleaning the data, the more we find other applications for the drugs that we currently have in market. So I wish we could really accelerate that. And we've put real muscle behind that over the last 2-3 years of building the right platform, the right infrastructure, in collaboration with many others as well. And then more and more, I think technology is a role to play in there as well. You see more and more a push towards decentralized learning, split learning, where your data never leaves your infrastructure, but you can collaborate with academic institutions, with highly respected single pairs with real-world evidence data, and so you can really tweak your algorithm accordingly to really go and help the population on the back of that. I think that's the journey we are really going on right now.
Do you find though that regulators in different markets and countries, do the privacy concerns affect your ability to pull all of that data together?
So much a challenge. So far, the challenge has been more technologically. What can we do to link to each other? Because all those hospital systems, all of us, don't talk to each other. That data doesn't talk to each other. And think again about all the great good it could do if it could. So we are all talking about that quite extensively with the likes of IBM, of Google, of Microsoft. There's been a major push right now for data standard protocols. So we're trying to almost auto-regulate ourselves, but not as a reaction, but because we feel passionately with new standards called FHIR, for example, in data setup, so that we all talk about data in a similar way so that we can make that. And ultimately, I think there's another piece that is important of that equation. We are a bit an antiquated industry in some ways, where it's a doctor-patient relationship, where the data is largely owned in a file, on paper, or on an electronic health record in the doctor's office. I'd love to completely change that on its head, where the patient owns their own data. At the end of the day, as a patient, I feel that it's my own data. Whether I've changed hospital system, a clinical trial, and others, how do you give me access to that, and then let me decide where I want to give access to as well on my own right terms, and on us to make sure that there's absolute clarity about the privacy and how we respect it.
I think that's a good place for IBM to talk about, okay, how are you working to create the solutions to network all of this data that could be leveraged?
Well, the first thing is this idea of data ownership. It's a really important point. And obviously we have a large view that whoever creates the data owns the data is a very important point. And I think obviously one of the things that's going to be important going forward is how consumers, how citizens have ownership of the data and how it's being used, and the leverage of technologies like blockchain we're seeing around the world to allow permission to data, and how we will walk around effectively owning ourselves, and will then give ourselves to these various platforms on some kind of basis that we're comfortable with in terms of how they're going to use that information. And then the principles of things like transparency, reciprocity, I'm comfortable giving you this because I'm getting this good back, whether it's a good to me or a good to a broader societal aim. And then of course the accountability, how that information is going to be used once I do choose to give it to you. So I think we see those kind of principles starting to be pretty important, and I think as you start seeing, frankly, a consumer backlash against being concerned about how the data is being used. We did a survey last year, and some 80% of about some 13,000 people we spoke to, said that they were becoming much more concerned about how the data was being used, but also how they were feeling good about the kind of companies that were showing some transparency to that. So I think that's an important piece to it. Well, separately, I think the idea about how you start to create the infrastructures that can leverage the incredible power of all this data. I mean, we are living in a world where there's so much more we can do with data. I mean, I think the business platforms that can be built, the new businesses that can be created, the new services that can be delivered are a massively fantastic opportunity in healthcare and across all of our industries. And that is an opportunity, but in doing it, we've got to have this kind of intent, purpose, transparency mindset.
Having consumers understand what their data is and who owns it, that they own it, for example, and can give permission for it to be used. Is it realistic to expect me, any other consumer, to really understand the implications of my data, and to, particularly when there's so many companies that have data on us and want more data on us, and we're not entirely sure where that data is going to end up? I mean, is it realistic to, Alan, to think that consumers have enough knowledge at this point to be able to know what to do with their data?
I think the short answer to that is probably, the short answer to the question is no. I don't think it's actually possible for any of us to really understand, especially considering that the ground is changing under our feet so quickly, what our data is actually used for. So this is one of the things why trust is so important. I think it's extremely important that you trust the organizations where you know you are exchanging data. If you actually feel like I can go to, like for instance in our case, to LinkedIn, that I understand what is being done with my data and I have control over it, that's kind of, I think, right now, the best place for a consumer, for me as a human being. Like, I know that I put this information, my profile, out into LinkedIn in order for other people to see it. I understand how it's being used in that way. Therefore, I can form a trusting relationship with LinkedIn. I understand there's transparency about what it's being used for. Right now, trusting companies that are dealing with data is really important. I think one of the things which is challenging about the regulatory environment is that I don't think we've had a good conversation yet, or I can say it in the United States. We haven't had a good conversation about values yet. Like, what do we care about? I mean, when you see people butting heads in the Congress and yelling at each other about technology, I think that that's a conversation which is being had without exploring, like, well, what do we really want it to be? Because I think that companies can be articulate about that, And I believe that the way we govern ourselves, we can be articulate about that. But I don't believe we're actually having that conversation. It shouldn't forestall the drive towards regulation, because it's important, but it's a conversation which I think would make it easier for us to not act as if these are two mutually antagonistic forces. I don't think they need to be.
Well, unfortunately, we've run out of time, but I want to thank you all. Please help me in thanking our panel here. Gillian Tans from Booking.com, Alan Blue from LinkedIn, Bertrand Watson from Novartis, and Mark Foster from IBM. And thank you again, IBM, for allowing us to have this conversation. Thank you.